The story of Samsung begins in 1938 as a small trading company that sold noodles, dried fish, and local vegetables. Back then, it was impossible to imagine that Samsung would turn out to be one of the world's largest empire and produces so much more than you would think. Samsung have created skyscrapers, roads, hospitals, clothes, robots, and far, far more. They even had an aerospace division that created helicopters and tanks for the military. First, let's introduce Libyan Chol, who founded Samsung when he was just 28 years old. He told that one night he had a horrifying realization that he was just wasting his life, and that it was high time to set a clear goal for himself, and so he committed at that moment to building a business. Despite Samsung's humble beginnings of selling noodles, fish, and vegetables, Lee always had a much bigger vision. He chose the name Samsung, as in Korean it means 3 stars. Now, for many of us, 3 stars may sound like a mediocre product review, but in Korea, it has a different meaning. The number 3 is very popular as it represents something big and powerful, and star is used to represent something everlasting. Now, big, powerful, and everlasting are certainly perfect words to describe what Samsung has now become. But initially, it didn't seem like Samsung was even going to survive, as the Korean War had a catastrophic impact on Lee's business and over the entire country. The business suffered badly, as after the war, there was a deficiency of products and Korea was thoroughly dependent on imports. So, Lee decided to expand and diversify his business and create affordable goods for the public. His intentions were really good for his country and the people. He took the initiative by creating a sugar refinery, and then using the profits from that, he opened the largest woolen plant in the country. This allowed Samsung to enter and expand into textiles, and they began creating finished products like clothing. Since it was diversification that allowed Samsung to survive, Lee decided to pursue this strategy further, more aggressively, and reinvested the revenue he made into other new areas, like opening a departmental store and getting into the insurance business. In fact, to this day, Samsung is the largest insurance provider in South Korea. With all of this rapid expansion of his business, it wasn't long before Lee was the richest man in the country, and he was about to get a lot richer. In 1968, Samsung executives conducted a meeting and decided to enter electronics market. A year later, Samsung Electronics was fully established, and they created a 12-inch black and white TV. Within a decade, they'd become the world's #1 black and white TV manufacturer. Much thanks to their efficient assembly line production, this success led them to start producing all kinds of home appliances. Like in 1979, they began making microwaves. In 1980, they started producing air conditioners. In 1981, they produced 1 million color TVs. And in 1983, they got into making personal computers. But they soon realized that to produce all of these electronic goods, they were thoroughly relying upon importing numerous small components from abroad. So, they bought a semiconductor company to have full control over the supply chain themselves. They not only used these chips in their own products, but exporting them globally to other electronics manufacturers, opening yet another product line for Samsung. In fact, one of their many customers is Apple, who have used Samsung memory chips in their iPhones, despite the two companies being fierce rivals in the smartphone market, which we'll get to shortly as well. But what's really fascinating about Samsung is that all the industries they've expanded into that you never normally hear about. For example, under a division called Samsung Heavy Industries, Samsung specialize in making giant ships and are one of the largest mega ship builders in the world. There's also another division called Samsung Construction and Trading that makes roads, tunnels, bridges, and buildings. Remarkably, the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, was built by Samsung. And before that, Samsung was also involved in making the previous tallest building in the world, the Petronas Towers. They even own South Korea's largest theme park called Everland, have their own hotels, and own a place in Korea called Samsung Town. So whilst many of us probably know the Samsung brand from its success in mobile phones and consumer monitors and gadgets, that's just a glimpse of something much more bigger and larger. Now, Samsung's nonprofit foundation, which includes a university and a hospital called Samsung Medical Center, haven't been mentioned yet. However, the fact that Samsung have expanded into so many industries may sound like an incredible business success story. a young entrepreneur starting with a simple idea and then diversifying into more and more markets, and gradually building an empire. But that is certainly not the full story. The real truth and whole story is much more controversial. Now, if you are enjoying this video so far, please press the notification button so you don't miss out on such amazing stories, and it helps us to build the channel further. So, following the Korean War, South Korea was in a catastrophic condition, not producing or exporting many goods. The president, anxious to boost and expand the economy, and took a decision to offer easy financing to large Korean businesses to support them and protect them from competition. In other words, Samsung and a couple of other big South Korean businesses got given extremely favorable loans, special tax breaks, and a bunch of their support measures from the government to help them develop further. The idea was that by helping these big companies grow a lot larger, it would help boosting the country's economy. Government supported Samsung so much that right after Samsung started working on electronics, the South Korean government banned several other countries like Japan from selling electronics in South Korea, pushing consumers towards Samsung products. Instead, around this time, the South Korean government also reduced taxes by 50% on companies operating in the electronics business. But here's the thing. Samsung was by far the biggest company in the industry at the time by a huge distance, and so they benefited way more than anyone else. In fact, the government was essentially dispersing American relief fund that South Korea received after the war straight into Samsung. And this helped Samsung to expand so rapidly, and this was all thanks to Samsung's founder, Lee, and his ability to make very strategic political connections, like becoming good friends with South Korea's presidents. As a result of this friendship, Samsung continually got special treatments, like they didn't have the same export limits which other companies had. There was also another incident where government-associated banks started offering Lee extremely generous credit terms, so that Samsung had more money to fund their expansion plans. But when Lee got the money from these banks, he used some of that money to stop buying those same banks who had given him the credits. Now, it is not wrong to say that by the government helping Samsung so much in several ways, it helped the whole of South Korea's economy, especially because Samsung employed huge amounts of people as it grew. But due to this favorable treatment of Samsung by government, other small businesses often ended up getting hurt. How could anyone compete with a government-supported conglomerate with such vast resources and wealth? Samsung could crush anyone they wanted when they entered a new market, which meant that some viewed Lee as a symbol of corruption. It could also be argued that by helping Samsung so much, the South Korean economy is now over-reliant on one single company. If things go bad for Samsung, it could have a terrible effect on the entire nation, especially because Samsung is so heavily involved in so many different industries. In fact, a study in 2014 found Samsung composed about 17% of the entire South Korean economy. You see, Samsung is one of South Korea's tables, a Korean term that refers to family-owned conglomerates that have built giant empires through close government ties. There are a few others, like LG and Hyundai, but Samsung is the largest, and basically because these business empires are kept within the family, it means that just a few families in South Korea had a vast amount of the country's wealth, power, and influence. So when Samsung's founder Lee Byung-chul died in 1987, his son Lee Kun-hee took over the business. And this is where Samsung's ties to the government get even more controversial. Firstly, in 1996, Lee Kun-hee was charged with bribing a former president. However, because of Samsung's government connections, the president at the time pardoned him. With no further action taken then in 2008, Lee Kun-hee was accused of managing a political slush fund which was used to bribe prosecutors and politicians. He was found guilty of tax evasion and embezzlements, to which he apologized and stepped down from the company, but there was no jail time. Within just 2 years, the new South Korean president had pardoned him, and Lee Kun-hee went back to work as the chairman of Samsung as if nothing had happened. So on 2 separate occasions, Lee Kun-hee had been charged with bribery, corruption, and tax evasion, and on both occasions, he was pardoned of all wrongdoings and didn't go to jail despite the overwhelming evidence. This just shows how tightly Samsung and the government are connected. Even when publicly convicted of a crime, the government simply cannot spoil its ties with Samsung because of its dependency on the empire. The president can just reverse it, and this goes even further. In a controversial book entitled Think Samsung, written by Samsung's former chief legal counsel, It was alleged that Lee Kun-hee stole around $9 billion from Samsung's subsidiaries, destroyed evidence, and bribed government officials to guarantee his son would succeed him as the head of Samsung. In addition, several presidential candidates and aides have reportedly been given bribes by Samsung. Now, Samsung denied some of these claims, and most of South Korea's media refused to even mention this book because Samsung is such a huge part of the country that an attack on Samsung can be perceived as an attack on South Korea itself. There is also a possibility that the media simply didn't want to go on Samsung's bad side, given how powerful the company is. For example, in an article titled "South Korea, the Republic of Samsung," the author suggested that Samsung's chairman is more powerful than the president of South Korea, and that many Korean people have come to think of Samsung as invincible and above the law. Essentially, the company has vast influence over the government, media, and entire country. And just to make things even more grotesque, when eventually Lee Kun-hee's son took over after him, he was also found guilty of embezzlement and bribing politicians, just like his father had been. Now also look at it this way, that we are looking at the actions of a small number of individuals here. Samsung is a giant conglomerate of hundreds of thousands of employees. So it's obviously unfair to tarnish all of Samsung with the actions of just a couple of people. Plus, clearly Samsung have done plenty of good in South Korea as well. But it's interesting once you see the kind of shady backroom dealings and bribery that went on and the deep ties to the government, suddenly Samsung's success story isn't quite the fairy tale it may have seemed initially. Anyhow, the story is not done yet, because it wouldn't be complete without adding into the plot one of the biggest disasters in Samsung's entire history. Now, in 2016, many customers of Samsung all around the world witnessed the scenes of Samsung Note 7 smartphone on fire multiple times, and due to this, airlines soon banned the phone from flights. What is more concerning is that Samsung knew about several of these incidents and initially did nothing. They were extremely slow to react, and it was only as more phone explosions happened that the media picked up the story, and Samsung was forced to stop production and recall the products. This cost them over $5 billion, not to mention all of the reputational damage to make things even worse. The initial replacement product Samsung issued also had the same overheating problem. That's because initially, Samsung put the blame on the battery as being the issue, but actually it was more complex than that. It wasn't down to just one faulty component that could easily be replaced, but instead, it was linked to the internal design and the way the components in the device were basically crammed too closely together. But in many ways, the real root cause of the problem can be traced back to Samsung's ongoing battle with Apple. If we rewind back to 2011, Apple was suing Samsung, claiming they basically copied the design of their iPhone, demanding billions of dollars. While Steve Jobs publicly called Samsung copycats, Samsung felt this was ridiculous, given that Apple had taken plenty of inspiration from competitor products themselves over the years. But Samsung executives were determined to create something new and change the narrative of Samsung being followers instead of leaders, and thus they launched their Galaxy Note series. A cross between a tablet and a smartphone, but for the Note 7 model, Samsung executives wanted to add in lots of new features, and they also demanded tight deadlines with very aggressive specifications. Samsung engineers recall that the pressure to make the device on time was extremely intense, and that it became a chaotic rush to finish the product by the deadline. They didn't realize it at the time, but basically, in the race to try and beat Apple, Samsung had rushed the product's development too much. They'd crammed the Note 7 with too many features and not spent enough time on quality control. Of course, before realizing the issues, they sold millions of these dangerous phones all around the world and spent gigantic sums of money on marketing it. And as if this hadn't been a big enough disaster already, Samsung then tried to suppress information about the whole thing. For example, when people on YouTube created parody videos on Grand Theft Auto with characters using Galaxy Note 7s as exploding grenades, Samsung copyright striked the videos despite having absolutely no rights to do so. This backfired further as their attempts at censorship created yet more buzz and controversy around the whole story. However, despite all of the drama, both with their products and with their owners, Samsung have clearly continued to have incredible success. They've created innovative products like their folding phone, they've generated more revenue than companies like Google and Microsoft, and they'll no doubt continue to keep entering all kinds of new markets, given the very humble beginnings of how Samsung started. It really is quite amazing what the company has now become, and it's enough proof that with enough hard work, anyone can turn their small business into a giant empire. But of course, there must be some great connections and free capital too. Thank you for watching, and see you guys soon.